I want you to consider these things when you watch me talk about my work. I want you to think about what stories are being told, which stories are being held in silence and live in silence, and that is work timeless, or is it made to mark this time, this present moment? And I think about the fragility of our voices and stories, and like this piece, like freckles, like eggshells, and like stone, I think about our collective voices and how it can feel so fragile like an eggshell. It can be so spotted and indelible like a freckle, and it could be hard and heavy like a stone. And that I want you to think about how these tiny but mighty objects have a lot of power, and that I want you to treat everyday objects as monuments to overturn. I think a lot about this piece right now as we gear up for another presidential election, which I do not know if I have the energy to go through this again. But I made this piece when I was an artist in resident at Kohler, the toilet sink tub factory in Sheboygan, Wisconsin. And that I was one of a few women working on the factory floor on the day I checked my phone because I had lots of notifications, and it was the day that the Supreme Court overturned Roe. And I cried. I cried in my space, not sure if the men around me understood why I was so sad and so angry at the same time. And that did they even care? Did anyone even care? And how could this happen? And so I channeled it and made this piece. And then this piece, as part of this residency, you're required to donate a piece to the collection. So this lives in the John Michael Kohler Art Center collection, because one day when someone researches that archive, I want them to remember my body was there in this male-dominated factory on the day we lost our important right. I make work that conveys the tension between domesticity and control, pointing to the layers of dominance, toxicity, and harm caused by whiteness and its many systems and mechanisms of oppression from present day and throughout history. I am mad that we have not overcome more as people and as women, and that every time I feel like we make steps forward, constantly being pulled back. And that basket of those precious porcelain China girl figurines represent the community I carry with me everywhere I go, and the ones I continue to advocate for. And that I can't be tamed. I make work that challenges the social, political, and cultural systems, and that I think a lot about generational upward mobility. I think about how in every family there's one oral historian, the one that carries the stories from our grandparents and then their grandparents and their generation. And I think a lot about how my Chinese family can trace itself back 28 generations from Guangzhou, China. And that there's a plaque in the hometown where it has our family names, but only that and the names of sons. So my story doesn't matter, my mother's, my grandmother's doesn't matter in this legacy. And so I think about this every time I move up in this world, and I have to keep telling their story because our names are not on those plaques. And that I navigate multiple identities, and this I think about a lot as this photograph as a major source and inspiration for my work. As a baby art student, I found this in a pile of photographs, and I instantly thought how funny this was, and that my parents are on the far left. My father literally doesn't fit in the photograph, but most likely the photographer of this image was Chinese and felt like he didn't fit in there as well. And I have many photographs where my father's head is cut out. It's kind of really funny at this point. But I learned to live with the constant question about my appearance. What are you? The Lyft driver, even when they were taking me here today, asked me that. He was also an older Chinese man and said, I don't look like I'm from here. And I don't know what that means, because I thought everyone's from LA. But how I answer that depends on my hair, my makeup, my clothes. I've had every single hairstyle my entire life. I love changing my hair. And that it's kind of where I'm at, who I am feeling at the moment. But I find that people are rarely satisfied with my answer. And that I've always dealt with identity, with the sense of being in between, an imposter to my identity, feeling neither fully Chinese nor Caucasian. And I make work using porcelain because of this. Porcelain because it can trace its roots back to Jindijin, China. It's a cultural bridge. It's a material I find so much meaning and metaphor in. That I think a lot about the term of whitewashing, about how we lead with authenticity and representation. And then I think about this performance piece, an act of domestic labor, washing these porcelain because it was valued for whiteness, and that whiteness traveled the world. And that I use that as a metaphor for whiteness as a privileged racial class. And so I wash these unfired teacups and saucers and then adorn my face with this precious white material. My parents were married in 1978 in McDonald, Ohio. My mother, the youngest of 5 children, was the only one in her family to not have an arranged marriage. She came to the United States as a refugee through family immigration, chain migration, something that Trump has said many times he wants to shut down, and that my father's family disapproved of him marrying a woman of color, and that my mother can be easily categorized as brown, my father white, and here I've been told many times that I'm nearly yellow, and that they could not fully understand how to navigate an interracial marriage within their families and the small towns we lived in, nor could they fully relate to my experiences of growing up biracial. But to me, this photograph depicts what exactly it is, an American family. And that I lived with a mother whose beauty was all-consuming, but she was always perceived as our maid, my father's war bride that was rescued from Vietnam, and always I heard the word exotic, and that this beauty shaped her identity. In many ways, it was her superpower. And my mother's name loosely translates to the equally beautiful sweet plum. But she was always quick to tell me every day that my teeth were bad, my eyes were bad, I had too many freckles, I was sometimes too dark, and that I inherited all my flaws from my white father. And I often wonder how I can come from something so bitter and so sweet at the same time. And sometimes I have to really convince people that I grew up in an authentic Chinese household by look at all the stuff we had. And that I never really understood all of it. I often thought it was partially junk, but then we were taught to value and prize it. So we had this china cabinet that went with us everywhere we lived, through every weird small town, because my father was a police officer and he trained canine dogs. So I also think that's why I have problems with power structures and authority. But this china cabinet was the first thing we set up in every house. And I think about how one day when I finally opened it, that plate in the background was plastic. And it was the plastic representation of a traditional Chinese plate found in most homes, most restaurants. And that I think about that Buddha that lives in the background, given to my parents on their wedding day in hopes that one day their household was blessed with future sons. And instead they got first me, and then 2 sons later. And that even my brothers fully acknowledged that my mother treated me differently than them. And that I think a lot about these broken shards and going on many research trips to Jindajin, the birthplace of porcelain, that I love going to the ghost markets. I love the term ghost market as a beautiful way of saying antique markets because I believe these objects haunt our lives and have so many stories to tell. And that I think about how these broken shards, which they keep digging up every time they build new buildings, tear down old ones, and how they're priceless and worthless at the same time. And what I love every time I go is like the new parts of ceramic history I learned, and I think a lot about the labor that runs this so that we can have porcelain objects to use, eat, and drink out of. And I love this Ling long rice bowl pattern. It's a bowl that I have been tracking its prices, especially during times of inflation. That this bowl, when it's believed a long time ago that they would embed rice into it, and then when the rice would burn away, that's what would create that translucency. And that's like physically impossible. It's a special glaze that makes that happen. But visiting that factory in Jindajin and seeing just like the thousands of bowls, the many hands of labor that touch it. And it was always women doing the cleaning, the decorating, the glazing, and how quickly they would work, and how it took so many hands to make this bowl that I can find at my Asiana market in Mesa, Arizona for $2.19. It used to be $2.13. And so I think about all these broken pieces that make me up, the broken pieces in which I think about through my research and my experiences and how they come together. And I find that there's a lot of beauty in the broken, and that these little fragments and shards are so important for how I build myself back up. But I like to destroy things and build them up before I know how to move forward. So I wanted to destroy the tiny garden that lives above my eyes. And I pluck one hair at a time and say, he loves me not. The nursery rhyme my dad taught me, I remember being 7, being in a field of flowers and destroying the beauty of this flower in hopes that the last petal landed on my heart's intended desire. And I often question why I was taught to find love and acceptance in that of men. So with no eyebrows, I just decided to adorn my face with beautiful blue and white eyebrows. And I would say this was a major aha moment in my practice. No eyebrows, no frame of reference for people to look at me in my face, nowhere for their eyes to land. I wanted to pluck the beauty of this blue and white vessel and put it on my face. I was in Jindajian, China in like 2011, and I had walked into a tattoo shop, and at that time tattoos were still really rare. You were kind of considered bad if you had tattoos. I think that perception has changed so much in China now. But it was a tattoo shop for eyebrows. And I could pick an eyebrow called Sleeping Beauty, Cinderella. They were all eyebrow shapes that were depending on the arch, how close together, or how long the tail curled around your head. And I love that I could find beauty in Disney princesses in Shanghai. And I thought about this a lot. I was there to research blue and white patterns and how they've traveled the world. And I saw this crisscross of global migrations happen. And I see the world now with things in information, aesthetics, styles, systems moving all the time, and I want to figure out the things that get messy in the middle. It took about 6 weeks for my eyebrows to grow back, and then I did it again, and they didn't really grow back, and they did it again, and they didn't really grow back, so now they're tattooed on. So I think a lot too, but it's gotten much better. When my aunties and mom got their eyebrows tattooed on, it was like thick black Sharpie markers and surprised all the time. I like to think mine are a lot better, but I think a lot about the beauty standards within this practice too. There's certain parts of my practice I can control. At this point, working in clay, I understand its limitations and possibilities, and I still maybe randomly blow up something in the kiln, and I often say this is the kiln's fault, not my fault. But with my own body, I found that it was hard to confront the idea of pain. It's the hardest thing when we think about performance-based practices. But I felt like I was making work about identity and hair, and I thought I should just use this material that I grow and I take care of. I so lovingly take care of. And so in 2014, I started this process of cutting my hair into a bowl and then bleaching it the whitest blonde it can do. And then I turned part of my body into an object. So I used that blue spray paint that you use to paint your body for football games, and this was shot with a GoPro camera. Ironically, in the studio, we pushed the wheels aside, so I did feel like I made a bowl in the clay studio. And I think it's also the most athletic thing I've done, too. But everywhere I went with this bowl, first, it doesn't help when you have a bowl haircut and everyone references the movie Ghost and Demi Moore, and I don't need that reference anymore. But people didn't know how to confront me. That bowl haircuts are pretty amazing. They are a genderless haircut, but when you think about it, all haircuts are genderless. And that, what is it about being in Germany and having a bowl haircut and it's uber cool, but when you're an Asian kid with a bowl haircut, it's the worst nightmare, and you had an awful haircut from your mother at home. It is a rite of passage for us, though. And so then I kept making more bowls. And then there was a certain point where my hair just could not take this anymore and it could not go back. I broke my bowl by shaving my head, and that many times people questioned why I shaved my head, because why would I do that to myself? Why would I erase and remove my femininity? And many times people would think I either was sick or that I broke up with my partner. And that every time people would question me about it, I would tell them what my partner said. And my partner, who's Japanese, born and raised in Hawaii, told me this. He's like, I can't wait to take you to the beach so you can take a dip in the ocean and feel the ocean water run down your head and down your neck. And when I would say that to people, they would go, oh. I felt really lucky in 2015 with a shaved head and no eyebrows. I went back to Jindajian, and this is where no one knew how to place me. That going to China, people, I would walk into a store and I'd hear them say in Chinese, her eyes are Chinese, but her nose isn't. And then I would try and explain, because I grew up speaking Cantonese and trying to understand this regional dialect of Mandarin and Jindijin, I would try and say, well, I've been trying to get rid of this nose my whole life. And so I found that too, because of this and the way I looked, whenever this man rode by on his motorcycle, people pushed me to him. He was a hair dealer. He would, on his ride around the city of 3 million people, asking to buy your ponytails of hair or your old iPhone, and that I could trade that all for that stainless steel cooking bucket on the back or for some cash. And then I convinced him to let me come to his house, where I learned about his family business, and that the wives would prep and bundle the hair while the brothers, their husbands, they were brothers, would ride around just collecting ponytails and then take it to a hair market in northern China. And here we were sitting there, I was like holding ponytails, fluffing them, stroking them, combing them, checking them for gray hair, checking if they were unprocessed virgin hair. The language of this is like so icky sometimes, but it really becomes a whole commercial market. And I think about this image a lot, like the corner of that chair, and I know, and like that, even the flip-flops and the shoes, I know this is a picture from China. And I went down this deep dive about how across the world, women and girls grow their hair for money. Different nationalities are prized for their virtues, but a hair dealer and his family said Chinese hair was the best for wigs because it can mimic any texture or style, and it can be transformed into any color, and then it holds its value at market. And that genetically our hair grows about 1/2 inch a month, where most people's hair grows 1/4 inch a month. So there is some genetics and science within this, but if you think about it, if time is money, growing your hair is a long time to make money. And I started looking at all these like probably really weird websites where you can buy lots and bundles of hair. And like many times too, the hair would be choreographed or staged onto like Peruvian rugs to show that the hair came from Peru, or Slavic hair with Russian ornaments and objects in the background. And so I thought, what does this look like in the context of like where we live today? And like learning too about the global migration of porcelain, blue and white, and human hair are all intersections of labor, power, and white ideals of beauty and industry. And that even this piece, I bought this hair from an eBay seller whose mother had a hair shop and only bought the Beverly Johnson hair collection, who is an iconic African-American female model. And that she said she only bought hair made in China. And that's where we already dehumanized the material, and that the hair isn't made in China, it comes from people in China. And so this bundle of hair is placed on my version of a blue and white penny tile with blue and white transfer patterns purchased in Jindijin to make this kind of really third culture, cross-culture exploration of hair. That even when I wanted to bleach some of that hair and dye it a different color, when I did that, the hair turned gray. So I got fake hair. So I find that kind of interesting too, and I feel like that's an idea that's been marinating for a really long time. I also started purchasing wigs made of Chinese hair off of eBay that were under $50, and that I think a lot about the human hair industry, and that Black women in the United States propel it based off of white standards of beauty, but from hair that comes from the poorest of women in many countries. And that was the part of this like equation I was interested in exploring, is that third space, the one that we never consider or talk about when we talk about these power ideals and structures. And that so often when we talk about race, we talk about black, white, and the other, and that other space gets so full of and lumped together with everyone's experiences. And so I think about how, as someone who can be perceived sometimes as racially ambiguous, what does this mean in terms of like wearing a hairstyle I culturally and ethnically do not own, but from hair that I'm genetically close to, and thinking about cultural appropriation, appreciation, and does cultural reappropriation even exist? And like when I first made this work in 2016, I think we all fumbled through those conversations, and I think about now, like 8 years later, how we have these conversations about material and race and culture. And I still think the answers to this are still coming and building. I work a lot within hair and nail salons. I find them as sites of sisterhood, but they're also sites of where appropriation happens. And I was really interested in like how in the time I was living in San Antonio, Texas, the only places I can regularly see my Asian community is through a nail salon. And I walked into one and asked them, give me blue and white nails. And they went, oh, like the pottery. And I love that everyone has some sort of foundation for what blue and white patterns are and how they kind of loosely relate them or attribute them to somewhere in Asia, but they don't really know the origins. So for me, this was collaborating with nail salons and nail artists because I find that they paint the tiny canvases so beautifully, that there's such an intimate experience to have someone cut and trim your cuticles and paint your nails and hold your hands while they work on them, while also telling like your biggest life secrets to a complete stranger. I've heard the word exotic my whole life, and I think this also shows I was really looking at Instagram hashtags during this time in my practice, and like I hate that that kind of dates this work, but I'm gonna go with it because I think that was really important at the time. Exotic AF, I remember talking about this with people and many didn't know what the AF meant, and I think now everyone kind of does. Yeah? Okay, great. I think oftentimes the label exotic came many times with the gesture of taking your hands and pulling your eyes into slits and then saying it to me as though it was supposed to be a beautiful affirmation, that's something I would love, or to mock or joke me. And in those moments, I'm no longer recognized as half, but as whole to people. And this is where I found this loving relationship with this China girl figurine, found in a friend's garage, where she found at a hobbyist shop, and she didn't know what to do with it. And now that I've talked about this so much, everyone gives me these, and it's such an interesting object. Stereotypical China girl figurine from the 70s. She wears a rice picker's hat. She has a heavy shoulder yoke across her back. She's barefoot in her labor. And she sits atop a trophy case full of broken blue and white willowware patterns. I heard a curator say one time that willowware, that pattern there, which is a chinoiserie pattern, created in England, but then traveled the world and then copied through all countries throughout Europe, Japan, and even China, that it is the most appropriated pattern in the world. I don't know how to source that or credit it, but I found that really interesting because you can see its iterations at every thrift store, your grandma's cabinet, and in many museums, and that the willowware pattern slightly changes through every country it travels through. And so that China girl is resting atop that revel, always constantly working to provide culture and love and patterns and decoration. I think too, a major thing happened in my practice where I stopped working in blue and white, and then I think I was really thinking a lot about the color red because it's a color we still are so violently living with. Thick is my large installation commissioned by Art Pace in San Antonio. This was the first artist in resident of this space was Felix Gonzalez Torres, where he did his famous curtain in this space. And I thought a lot about the time and the different thresholds we were all navigating, and how can we help each other along the way as we try to move forward in this world that feels like every person, every positionality, our whole personhood and humanity are being constantly attacked. So Thick is made of synthetic red hair, very much modeled after a red velvet curtain, the kind that a performer waits behind with an unknown audience on the other side. I think about the metaphorical thresholds we cross all the time, so going from girlhood to womanhood and how that gets taken away from us so sooner. Of being a woman and walking into all male spaces, I wonder how much bigger do I have to make myself? How much deeper do I have to make that voice? Or being a person of color and walking into all white spaces, how can we help each other along the way? So many times our situations happen and we sit in shame and silence, and I wanted to create a piece where I can create affirmations as something people can see. I started adorning affirmations on these beads. These curtains reference a lot of the macrame beads from the 70s. and thinking about when you brush through and the way the beads hit each other as a gentle sound and reminder for you to stop and read the bead. And that I've been collecting affirmations from people on Instagram. I'll host affirmation collection sessions during these exhibitions, and I love that they become really regionally specific. So one in San Antonio was "You got ganas," which means you got balls, and it's often lovingly said between women. To a 9-year-old boy who came and wrote, "Be the boss of your own body." And I love that this 9-year-old was being taught consent at an early age. From one from Germany that said, "Only a sausage has 2 ends." And then my favorite one from Finland, "One potato at a time." And then continuing to work with the color red and thinking too of how Chinese New Year is this week, and it was often a color celebrated in the household as luck and wealth and power, and thinking about how it's been co-opted and taken away from us in some ways. Live to Die is 300 custom plastic mats, kind of the red welcome mats found in front of many Asian businesses welcoming you to come in. My mats are custom printed with the phrase "Live to Die," a really simple 3-sentence phrase that I found embroidered on alphabet samplers from the 18th century here in the United States. That young girls would embroider this on alphabet samplers during a time where infant mortality was really high, life expectancy was not very long, and I thought about the power of young girls embroidering something so brutal, but also so true. It is the simplest way to describe us, that we all live to die. And that sandwiched in these mats are that China girl figurine, almost like the Princess and the Pea, that uncomfortable pea at the bottom of that stack of mattresses. And I want you to consider labor in this. And that when we say, oftentimes when I hear people say, "Well, it's made in China," we often equate it with things that are cheap, easy, or quickly made. But I often question what makes their labor any less than ours. How much of that labor provides us some quick, fast, comfortable thing right away? And that many times part of my practice, I don't always want to work within the zeitgeist, but it happens. And I've been saving this image of the original Oriental bamboo scratchers on my phone for years. I actually looked back and I first took that picture in 2014, and I just kept screenshotting it so I wouldn't get lost, because I was in my Walgreens in San Antonio and it was a display at the cash wrap. And I thought this was something here. And then the pandemic happened. On April 30th, 2020, I saw this floating around, and I present to you the most American photograph. I was living in Texas. I was watching protests happen where people were demanding that hair salons and nail salons open up right away so they can get a haircut for the nowhere we were going. And that I thought about the labor within that, the unprotected people behind the mask who showed up because it was their only option so that others can look good. And so I started making back scratchers, and back scratchers, they're still going in my studio. And I think about how I scratch your back, you scratch none. And I come from a long line of service industry Asians. My mother watched other people's children. She was a waitress. She sewed other people's clothes. My grandfather gutted fish. My uncle cooked in the back of restaurants. They were all teachers and engineers, and now they worked in service of others. And I think a lot about how we've all done that in many ways. That we carry so much for others. We raise other people's children. So my mother often went without so that I could go with. And that I think about how in the times I've worked in the service industry, you smile harder. You be more extra polite so you can get that bigger tip or even a tip. And how hard that is, and that extra emotional labor of having to always be nice. My neck, my back, if you know the song, "I'm So Happy For You," that's great, okay. The object on the left is a Chinese export wear porcelain pillow. A pillow that women would use to prop their neck up to protect their highly styled hairstyles. And that is a form of uncomfortable labor. So that way your hairstyle was perfect so you can navigate the social circles you work in. And I started using these babies to talk about the different weights that we carry. So Hustlers is a series of 3 of my neck, my back babies, stacked high with peach pits, blue and white porcelain pots, oranges, peaches. And it spins around on a gold mirrored Lazy Susan. Hustlers comes from shares the title of the movie starring J-Lo, which I found really amazing, based off of the true story of dancers who conned Wall Street money of men. They were modern day Robin Hoods. It's an amazing movie. But I think about the hustlers in my life, the women in my life who worked every single job, put up with so much so that I can be here today. And so these are displayed on a rotating Lazy Susan. I did want it to look like a stage. It's gold, it's shiny, it has a cheerleader pleat skirt. And so much about gold, I think a lot, too, about like the wealth and the abundance of it, the gold that I grew up in my home. Lazy Susans, have you called them Lazy Susans? You've slighted women's labor your whole entire life by calling Susans lazy. But they are turntables. The etymology, they believe, loosely comes from Thomas Jefferson calling his daughter Lazy Susan. But I grew up in going to dim sum restaurants where that large turntable really was the greatest tool. It would help serve many people. So these babies ride around on this motorized Lazy Susan, going hard. And that with all of this, I just wonder too, how can girls just have fun? Since I now just receive tons of objects, it also feels like my goal every time I go to a thrift store to rescue anything I see with an Asian woman on it. I have all these plates with geishas and empresses, looking beautiful, like very womanly, very docile and demure. And so I worked with a factory to water jet cut them out. I wanted to rescue them from these scenes where they were constantly fetishized. And that I put them in new scenes now, so they are having fun through the 4 seasons. So these geishas and empresses are surfing and bathing on the beach. And these were very much modeled off of those black lacquerware frames that I had growing up in my house. You see them in Asian restaurants where they are scenes of nature, where they are cranes, flowers. They're really beautiful, but they're seashells that have been dyed and cut. So these are my versions of them. And I hope in everything that everyone can see all forms of representation. They can find themselves in things. Goat girls are modeled after the ribbons that horses win as best of show for their beauty, their agility, and their hair. They are made from porcelain doll casting slip colors. There is a whole community of people that still make porcelain dolls at home. They are a wild bunch. And if you ever get to spend time with them, they create stories for each doll they create. And I think this is partially part of my practice as I end up becoming embedded in these communities and learning so much about it. And I think I'm happy to talk dolls with them, but I often ask, like, what about a doll that looked like me? And then they're like, oh, that's when, like, sometimes the conversation shuts down. But I've been buying these colors for a long time, and this is what happens with the problem of racial categorization, that the Asian color used to be called Oriental. We don't call people Oriental anymore. Well, some people do. But because of this too, now I couldn't find the Asian color, and now it's because it's called Sahara, like the desert. And so these are all made to kind of really honor the idea of being mixed, half or both, to celebrate the multiplication and division of our identities. And that everywhere I go, I really, really love, I get so many pictures, and like so many pictures of young kids trying to find themselves in it. And to me, that is like the best part of this piece. Because I know growing up, I just wanted a doll that looked like me. And that I want to think about how we create safe spaces for us, like spaces where we can have those hard, difficult conversations. And I thought about the idea of the man cave, and I really hate the idea of the man cave because that suggests that men need their own special place for relaxation away from the domestic space when I believe domestic spaces should be shared spaces. So my version, Babe Cave, is where you can come, sit, and talk and have a seat at the table. So you sit within this synthetic blue hair, this really beautiful kind of cool color, and you sit on this porcelain table and stools made in Jindajan China with an amazing family, where the brothers would throw the tabletops on the wheel. It's 3 feet wide. And then the wives would decorate while their children ran around the factory. And I spent 3 days with them painting this. The uterus, because I love how the uterus is on bumper stickers and t-shirts now. I just wish people knew how it worked. The peach, a symbol for longevity, but my peach is cut in half to really show how as our juiciness dries up and we age in this world, that peach becomes useless sometimes, but our seed is so powerful, that pit is so powerful. The Venus of Willendorf, who I feel like is pop culture icon, like Beyonce at this point in the world, the fertility figurine made in likeness of women and women's bodies. And the chrysanthemum, one of the few flowers that survives the first frost, so a flower of survival. And then around the border are affirmations that I've collected along the way, like girl, you can. Let go of preciousness, which I feel is like the one I lead with the most. There will be pain, which I think is so important to acknowledge. And that please give me the truth before you share your flowers with me. And I have so many cute pictures of young girls going here and playing Barbies on top of this table. And like, what other forms of protective spaces can we have? And so I want to display things up really high for you to look at but not to touch. Break Like a Girl and Ache Like a Woman are currently on display at LACMA. And I was thinking a lot about the Dutch garnitures I saw throughout my travels in the Netherlands. These really beautiful cabinets that displayed their wares up high and out of reach. And that I thought about what symbols that I felt like were forms of protection that like kind of helped me along the way. So I've thought about the Powderpuff Girls as like one of the few cartoons where they really just tried to save the world from evil. That was it. There is a really amazing episode though where they tried to save the world from a really evil curator that I need to rewatch, which I find really funny. And then the other side was Ache Like a Woman, adorned with fertility figurines and with flowers that represent innocence and purity. And that I want to display these up really high where you can look but you cannot touch. And that if you're staring at this too long and you're questioning what it is about that? What does that say about you, that you feel you can't have this or that you can consume this? And why do you over-sexualize it? And I would say part of this inspiration too was thinking about garnitures, a set of pots of related shapes and forms with shared imagery. I was also looking at images of cats on clear glass coffee tables and how they were smushed at the bottom, and I loved looking at those forms from the underside, and that's kind of just like how my weird brain works sometimes, of like where forms of inspiration strike. I showed you a form of like the staircase, and I use that as a form of ascension and of the idea of moving up. I think a lot of the same about ladders. We Climb was kind of my response to seeing this cartoon kind of flow in and out of my life. This cartoon from the 1870s around the time of the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was the first law to prevent one group of people from coming into this country. Trump's Muslim ban was the second. And how that these can be easily undone in seconds, but it takes decades and like hundreds of years to undo that harm. We Climb is my version of that ladder, kind of like the way Rapunzel threw down her hair, like allowing you to climb up for help. My is made out of synthetic and part of my hair with porcelain beads adorned from affirmations collected from the AAPI community. And a lot of times too, it was really hard to get affirmations from my Asian community because I think we've never heard them. And that so often the one I got from people was they just wish their parents told them they were proud of them. And like how those simple words can make you really propel you and you go a long way with them. So I am so proud of you. And I think about, too, the idea of being loved and feared at the same time, of being appreciated for our contributions to culture, but then being feared because we were suspected to be the origins of a virus. And that for the first time I saw so many people in my family afraid. I was afraid for my husband to leave the house. I spoke out about this during that time, and I got so many hate emails, and I think I can kind of deal with that, but the ones that hurt the most was, you don't even look like you're Chinese, which is like such a personal attack, is then to criticize the way I look and if I'm allowed to speak up about this. And then it also denies my whole experience. These are giant 36-inch diameter colanders used to wash and dry vegetables. And through those delicate perforations, I embroider hair in the forms of targets. And how so much about living as a non-coastal Asian, of living in the middle of the country, I think about how our public celebrations, especially around this time of year, in those like small, like I would say in Mesa, Arizona, and San Antonio, Texas, they become really private. And that makes me kind of sad, because we can't share our joy and celebrate what is like a fresh start to the new year. And then I want to have the opportunity to express I want to witness an example of refusal and complaint rather than enduring suffering. I want to reclaim, and I want to undo what has once harmed us. I think a lot about the expression, "me love you long time." I heard it my whole life. I remember hearing it going down a slide when I was in elementary school and not knowing what it meant. That it comes from the Stanley Kubrick movie, Full Metal Jacket, where a group of Vietnamese sex workers approach American GI soldiers saying, "Me love you long time." And then it lived for a long time through the Two Life Crew song, which I remember singing that song and also not fully understanding what it means. So also, I just read Britney Spears' memoir, and it's interesting to be alive now and see a critique of 90s girlhood and culture and this big cultural unlearning we're all doing. But also I felt like I was partially going through that of having an immigrant mother who didn't understand any of this, and a white father who didn't understand girlhood at all, and how I absorbed everything around me and I didn't fully understand it. So I wanted to reclaim this. It took me a long time. So in 2021, I made this neon sign where I proudly say, "Love yourself long time." And I think too of traveling throughout the small towns I navigate in the kind of Midwest and Southwest, I can always find that Asian restaurant from the neon, from that shaky handwriting that's the translation from kanji to English. And I know that's where I can find home. And that many times too, I think about how Asian women experience racism, but they also experience misogyny at the same time. And it's also the hypersexualization of ourselves and our bodies. And at the moment I've heard these things said to me, that I am recognized as whole. And that's sometimes really hard to battle with when you just want to be acknowledged for your identity or how you label and call yourself, but then in that moment when a racial slur is hurled at you is when people see you. I also partly something as part of my practice of how I consume culture, I'm constantly reading the news, I listen to podcasts, I watch anything from documentaries to trash TV, but this was floating around and I was instantly consumed with anger. Matthew Gates, the politician from Florida, tweeted this: "How many of the women rallying against overturning Roe are overeducated, underloved millennials who sadly return from protests to a lonely microwave dinner with their cats and no Bumble matches." And that is my cat, Shoji Hamada Kitty, who my husband and I say have the same attitude all the time. And I am a proud recent cat mom, and that I am an overloved millennial who did go to protests, who still goes to protests, who cooks amazing meals, and that I think about how much we have to keep fighting for this. And so I made giant cat bells large enough for women to wear, because I think about how my cat Shojin, I had to put a cat bell on her because she was killing too many birds. And I thought there was something so sweet about a tiny bell on this little cat that was a killer. So I wanted to embody that. So, and also Matt Gaetz doesn't realize that cats were also a symbol of the suffragettes, that they used that in their posters when they were fighting for the right to vote. And so this is like also when Trump keeps saying that this is a witch hunt, that witches were women. Like the irony of all of this is like so funny to me, how men use these terms to and don't understand that they were really against women. So I think about this a lot, and that tiny bell that shakes, and that Taylor Swift was kind of right, that karma is a cat. And so I want to leave you with that and tell you one potato at a time. Thank you so much.